There are numerous reasons why people get divorced. Um, but also, you have to consider all the various reasons that people stay in a marriage. Obviously, you have people that are in a happy marriage and they get along great. Sometimes you have people that are not happy in their marriage, but they stay with it because that's how they were raised, or they have some moral belief that staying in an unhappy marriage is your duty, or we stay together for the kids. But why do people get divorced? Well, obviously, I believe that people get divorced when they realize they're just unhappy. And it's not about being mad or having a bad day. It's about when you realize your spouse is sucking the life out of you, when you realize you can't live to your full potential because your spouse is deliberately holding you down. The idea of keeping a marriage together for the kids is somewhat absurd because you're not modeling grown-up behavior. What you're doing is hiding from a problem, and that's what you're modeling to the kids. Certainly, if they're really small kids, they may not know that you and your spouse don't get along. But if you have older, more sophisticated kids, do you believe that they don't feel the tension in the room when the spouse comes in? Do you believe that they don't see that you're walking on eggshells around your spouse? They know you're unhappy. They know that your relationship is not a functional, loving marriage. They understand that. And so the idea that you're keeping it together for the kids, no, you're not. You're keeping it together because you don't want to have a grown-up talk. You don't want to have to make a grown-up decision. You don't want to have to do the adult thing and put yourself in a happier place where you can be a more balanced parent, a more balanced co-parent, and get closer to living to your full potential. I think a lot of people live like roommates with their spouse toward the end of a marriage. There's no passion there. They may not love each other anymore. Certainly, they're not in love with each other anymore. And often they don't even like each other. If this was a roommate, you would move out. And so, I think people go through the motions of being in a marriage because they don't want to admit to their friends and family that they want a divorce. They don't want to be the first person in their family to get divorced. They don't want to be the only mom at the soccer game who's a single mom now. They don't want to be the guy who couldn't hold his family together. And so I think there's a lot of people who stay in a marriage just because they avoid making the decision to leave it. And if that really is where you are, then I think it's time to get really honest with yourself about what do you expect in a marriage relationship, and what do you expect for the life that you have to live. What kind of person do you want to be? What kind of a parent do you want to be? What kind of a co-parent do you want to be? Do you just want to be a roommate? You can't get this time back. I think a lot of people choose to get married because that's what you always do. That's the next step in your life. But when it's time to get a divorce, they'll put that off and put it off and put it off. And meanwhile, time is ticking by and you can never get it back. So, why do people get divorced? I think there's a lot of reasons, but I think really it all comes down to is when the marriage no longer serves the purpose. Your spouse doesn't have your back and you don't have your spouse's back. You don't like your spouse. You dang sure are not still in love with your spouse. If you're living like a roommate, it's probably time to start making decisions to get you into a new phase of your life. I think there's a lot of reasons why people choose to stay in a marriage. Like, why would you not get divorced? In a lot of ways, having run this business and dealt with hundreds of clients over a decade, one of the things that I see is people treat going to a divorce lawyer kind of like going to a dentist. They may have a sore tooth, and it's just kind of this chronic, annoying pain, but it's not so much that they actually want to, they're not going to go through the trauma of going to a dentist to deal with this tooth pain. But eventually that pain will become so acute that you can't wait to get to a dentist, and the dentist can do, whatever the dentist can do. You just want the problem fixed. I think a lot of people go through their marriage that way. Their marriage is no longer serving as the legitimate purpose of the marriage. They're not happy together. They don't do things with their spouse. They avoid their spouse. They're not intimate with their spouse. They basically just have a roommate relationship with their spouse. And they tolerate that like they tolerate that chronic tooth pain. Sooner or later, something happens in their life where the pain becomes really acute. Maybe there's abuse that occurs. Maybe a substance abuse problem picks up in the marriage. And, sometimes it's not new pain. It's a new bright, shiny object. Sometimes we'll see people in a in a long-term unhappy marriage, and then they get a glimmer of hope because they meet someone new. And when they meet someone new that thrills them, that makes them feel good about themselves again, reignites some romantic passion, all of a sudden they realize how painful their marriage is, right? So they get that acute pain, and then that's when they'll come to see us. So why do people stay in a marriage? I think the most universal reason that people stay in a marriage that's unhappy is because it's convenient. Instead of making a grown-up decision to move on with your life, you just stay in a marriage because it's the convenient thing to do. You just keep living like a roommate because it doesn't really hurt that bad. So you're waiting for something acute to happen, some acute pain, then they'll go and get a divorce. Alternatives to getting a divorce, for the most part, I believe really revolve around counseling. I think individual counseling is important for people to deal with their own emotional responses to their marriage and to life in general. So, getting the counseling that you need as a person, whether your marriage moves forward or whether you ultimately end your marriage, getting the counseling that you need to make sure that you're maintaining your own mental health, your own emotional well-being is really important. And it helps you make those informed decisions when you decide to stay in a marriage or you decide to exit the marriage. That having that emotional well-being and having a counselor that you can go and bounce ideas and thoughts off of is really beneficial. And then, of course, you've got, marriage counseling, where you got couples counseling where, a counselor will work with the parties and try to fix some communication problems. I think marriage counseling has a lot of benefits, especially when people are just realizing their marriage is not where they think it should be, long before animosity begins between the parties. When both people still want to save the marriage, I think that's the best time to do couples counseling. When the marriage is definitely on the rocks and things are definitely tense at home, there's resentment and animosity built between the parties. Going to couples counseling can be quite traumatic. The wounds, the emotional wounds are open and raw between the parties. So when a spouse says, hey, when you do this, I feel like that, the other spouse is not necessarily in an emotional place to be able to hear that in a constructive way. They hear that as an allegation. They hear that as an indictment of their own behavior, and they get defensive about it. Then they want to lash out. So that doesn't lead to productive sessions. So if you want to do couples counseling, my recommendation will be to get into that early when both parties are invested in it. If you want to do couples counseling and you talk to your spouse about it and they refuse, that is its own answer to you. So I'm not saying that means that the marriage is over, but if you say, hey, baby, we should go do some couples counseling, I'm not happy about where our marriage is, and they say, we don't need counseling, we're good, that is its own message. All right, that's its own answer because the other party doesn't care about your feelings. Now, I know that there's more than feelings that go into making a decision. There's lots of different ideas about, staying together for the kids and meeting our moral responsibility, honoring our vow before God. All those things factor in. But ultimately, when you start thinking about a divorce, the things that are happening in the relationship that lead you to think of divorce, when divorce first pops in your head, you've probably been unhappy for some time. So getting into counseling when you first realize that, I think, is the most beneficial way. And then, of course, you've got religious alternatives. Certainly, talk to your pastor, your religious leader, and see what guidance you can get that way as far as helping maintain your relationship. Um, so I think, it's not all or nothing. Certainly, there's counseling and stuff that you can do for yourself and for the couple. There's religious counseling. I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that there are options in the marriage to keep the marriage going, um, when there are conflicts that can be addressed in other ways. Specifically, what I'm talking about is intimate mismatch or sexual misalignment. One party has a significant sex drive and the other one doesn't. Um, there are people who will open their marriage. They can stay married while each party explores the sex life that they want to explore. And then we keep everything else in the marriage together, and we just get our sexual needs met outside the marriage. So that is an option too. That works for a lot of people. One party can have the sex life they want. The other party doesn't ever have to have sex and doesn't get nagged about it. And that really solves that problem in that marriage. So is that a long-term solution for folks? Maybe, maybe not. But certainly it could buy enough time for the kids to graduate high school, right? And then we don't have to worry about custody orders and all those things. So counseling, religious counseling, and other ethical non-monogamy type options can help save a marriage, at least in the short term. Filing a divorce, I think an important thing to know about a divorce when you get ready to file it is it affects every single part of your life. It affects you financially. It affects your parenting relationship with the children. It affects, obviously, your marriage relationship. It's going to affect your friend group because you're going to lose some of your friends in the vortex of the divorce, or we call it the divortex. Some of your friends are going to side with your spouse, and some of your friends are going to side with you. It's going to put stress on you that affects your work product at work. It can affect your work relationships, your colleagues at work, just because you are always talking about what's important to you, which is right now the divorce, and they get tired of hearing it, right? So now they start avoiding you. It can seriously affect like pretty much every aspect of your life, and you have to be ready for that. If you imagine your life as a timeline, your life is running, and then you have these overlapping timelines. You've got, you know, your work timeline. You've got the timeline of all the activities with your kids. You've got the timeline of walking the dog. You've got your timeline of sleep that you have to stay happy and healthy. You've got your timeline of, your religious activities, your church activities or whatever. You've got all these timelines that are all running. And when you add a divorce, it's just another timeline that runs concurrently with all of those. I think a big mistake that people make when they file a divorce is they focus so heavily on the divorce at the expense of the other timelines, at the expense of the other aspects of their life. They are so focused on the divorce for years, they forget to be a parent. They forget to cherish that time they have with their kids, because when they're with their kids, they're so focused on the divorce, they don't actually enjoy that time. They don't cherish that time. When they're trying to sleep at night, they're so wound up about the divorce, they're laying awake for hours and they wake up tomorrow exhausted, right? That can have a long-term effect on your mental health and your emotional well-being, as well as your physical health. People who are going through a divorce, they don't take care of themselves. They stop going to the gym, they put on the weight, they're eating terrible, they're eating garbage. And your body can only stay healthy if it's taking in, good nutrients, and you start feeding it a bunch of junk food. Your body can only make junk out of it. So, there's a lot of different effects from focusing on the divorce, these mal effects that can damage your life in the long term. Probably the most important thing to know before you go into a marriage before you go into a divorce is the divorce is going to be serious. It's a part of my life. It's not my whole life. I think you have to be ready to keep a perspective and keep a focus on the other aspects of your life and manage the divorce like you manage everything else. It gets its share. You do the due diligence to the divorce, but you also do your due diligence to your kids. You do your due diligence to the pets. You do your due diligence to yourself. You do your due diligence to your work, to your boss, and to your colleagues. So the divorce is part of your life. It's not your whole life. So you have to understand that going in, or the whole time you're getting divorced, it may take 6, 8, 10 months, a year, 12 months, 15 months. You're going to be miserable, and you want to avoid that. So I think that's the big thing to understand. It affects every part of your life, but it doesn't become your life.